Welcome to ILTV on the Hour. We are live here in Israel, bringing you the biggest headlines of the region. It's currently 7 a.m. in New York City, and it's 2 p.m. here in Israel. I'm Khaled Ben David, and here are the latest updates coming out of the The bodies of slain Israeli hostages Arie Zalmanowicz and Tamir Adar were returned to Israel Tuesday night after being handed over by Hamas via the Red Cross. The caskets were transferred from the Red Cross in southern Gaza. The remains were then taken to the Abu Kabir Forensic Institute in Tel Aviv for identification. The return of Adar and Zalmanowicz lowers the number of deceased hostages still held in Gaza from 15 to 13. Now, since the start of the ceasefire, Hamas has returned the remains of 15 hostages and released all 20 living captives. Zalmanowicz, one of the founders of kibbutz near Oz, was kidnapped during the October 7th attack and murdered in captivity weeks later. He was 85 years old and is survived by 2 sons and 5 grandchildren. He was described by his community as a farmer by blood who knew how to value the land and the weather. Adar, 38, served as Deputy Security Coordinator of Nir Oz, and he was killed while fighting to defend his community during the October 7th invasion. His body was abducted to Gaza by members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He is survived by his wife, Hadass, their 2 children, his parents, and siblings. Adar was posthumously promoted to the rank of Master Sergeant in the IDF Reserves. U.S. Vice President JD Vance continued his Israel visit today in his mission to shore up the fragile ceasefire in Gaza. Vance met with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning in Jerusalem, with the two first having breakfast together with their wives Sarah and Usha, and then having a working meeting. Vance will meet with President Isaac Herzog later today. Speaking to reporters after their discussion, both Vance and Netanyahu dismissed claims that Israel is a client state of the U.S., with the Prime Minister saying the countries form a, quote, alliance of partners who share common values and common goals. Here's more from Vance and Netanyahu.
This thing takes monitoring, and it's going to take a lot of work. I was in the CMCC, which we opened up yesterday. A lot of our Israeli friends working together with a lot of Americans to actually mediate this entire ceasefire process, to get some of the critical infrastructure off the ground, from the international security force to some of the reconstruction of Gaza. It's not easy. I never said it was easy, but what I am is optimistic that the ceasefire is going to hold and that we can actually build a better future in the entire Middle East.
We discussed this idea of the day after. Remember, everybody said you don't have a day after, you don't have a day after. We're just creating an unbelievable day after with a completely new vision of how to have the civil government, how to have the security there. Who could provide that security there? Again, there is no taking care of overall security always. And we discussed that, and I think we have some very, very good ideas how to proceed.
And yesterday, as Vice President Vance mentioned, he visited the U.S.-Israel Ceasefire Coordination Center set up now in the southern Israeli city of Kiryat Gat. There, Vance declared that peace is going to last and that Hamas disarmament is non-negotiable. He emphasized that, quote, choppy waters are expected in a ceasefire between people who hate each other and who have been fighting for a very long time. And he did call on Israel to be patient with the process. But he insisted the truce is going better than expected. Vance also said he does see a future role for Turkey in Gaza, while insisting the U.S. would not force Israel to accept any country as members of the international security force being drawn up from Arab and Muslim states that is expected to help secure a post-Hamas Gaza. Now, Vance, along with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and top Trump advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner, were dispatched by President Trump to see that all sides remain committed to ensure that the ceasefire is being implemented. This came after Trump warned that he could send international forces into Gaza to confront Hamas over its violations of the ceasefire deal, but said he would hold off for now to give the terror group a chance to course correct. And it is the 10th day of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The truce has generally been holding, but there continue to be serious incidents in Gaza. Most recently, 2 soldiers were lightly injured when their tank was hit by an explosive device in the Khan Yunis area. Now, the 2 wounded troopers were taken to hospital. The incident occurred during efforts by IDF forces to clear the area where they are stationed of any potential threats. Now, this incident came 2 days after the ceasefire was seriously tested, when gunmen emerged from a tunnel deep within Israeli-held territory in southern Gaza's Rafah, and then launched RPGs at troops, killing 2 soldiers and wounding 3 others in the same area. Now, according to an initial military probe of the latest incident in Gaza, no terror operatives were detected in the area when the bomb was detonated. The IDF is investigating when the explosive device was planted in the vicinity. And amid reports of policy clashes, Prime Minister Netanyahu has removed his national security advisor Tzachi Hanegbi in a surprise step that takes effect immediately. Hanegbi, a veteran Likud politician and a close ally of Netanyahu, reportedly clashed with the prime minister over some key war decisions, including the summer invasion of Gaza City and the unsuccessful strike last month targeting Hamas leaders in Qatar. Now, Hanegbi's deputy, Gil Reich, will take over as the acting national security advisor. Reich previously served as deputy director of Israel's Atomic Energy Commission. Now, in his departure statement, Hanegbi thanked Netanyahu for the opportunity to serve, but he did call for a thorough investigation in what he described as the terrible failure of October 7th. He warned that the war is not over and that Israel's mission to bring home all hostages and disarm must continue. Hanegbi also urged national unity, saying it is, quote, essential to ensuring the eternity of Israel. In other news, Israel is urging Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to drop his pledge to honor the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Prime Minister Netanyahu if he would travel to that country. Carney was asked in an interview with Bloomberg News published last week if he would fulfill the commitment of his predecessor Justin Trudeau to arrest Netanyahu on war crimes charges if he came to Canada, to which Carney replied yes. Now, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants last year for Netanyahu for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Gaza conflict. Israel rejects the jurisdiction of the Hague-based court and denies war crimes in Gaza. The Prime Minister's office issued a sharp rebuke, calling the Canadian decision a prize for terrorism that fuels anti-Semitism.
We believe that Prime Minister Carney should, of course, reconsider this and welcome Prime Minister Netanyahu, the leader of the only Jewish state and democratic country here in the Middle East, to Canada, if that were to ever happen. The recognition of a Palestinian state is a reward and it's a prize for terrorism. The Prime Minister has said this since countries decided to recognize it a few weeks ago. That has only poured fuel on an anti-Semitic fire in Canada.
Spokesperson Shosh Bedrosian, formerly of ILTV. Let's get back now to the main story, the latest developments with Gaza. And joining us for more on that is Alon Pinkas. He's the former Consul General of Israel in New York City and a former foreign policy advisor to Ehud Barak and Shimon Peres. Also with us, Professor Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Before we get into the details, some of the details, for example, regarding the Gaza situation. Overall, Alon, I'll start with you. You expect Vice President Vance to paint an optimistic picture. I'm not sure, though, that everyone in Israel or many would say necessarily or agree that the ceasefire is going better than expected and that in the hills and valleys we're in a hill. And how much is that a problem? Maybe these perhaps differing perceptions of how this ceasefire is going.
Well, I think that his prime objective in coming here was to make sure that Israel exercised restraint and adhere to the ceasefire, meaning be thoughtful when it comes to retaliation and reprisal for every Hamas infringement or infraction of the ceasefire, those that happened and those that are expected. In that respect, he has limited or confined his expectations level to the ceasefire, not to the next phases, which he alluded to and said, well, it's going to be more difficult, it's time consuming. But I think that in terms of his visit here, and reportedly the possibly Secretary of State Rubio is planning a trip here in the next few days as well. I think the idea here is to protect President Trump's achievement, and that is the ceasefire. As for the next phases, I think, I don't know. I haven't spoken to neither Trump or Vance, but I think they are both skeptical as to the feasibility of the next phases. So now, I think they're concentrating on the ceasefire.
Right. We'll get into some of those issues that obviously they're going to be discussing. But I want you to weigh in on this, Gerald, because the ceasefire, of course, we did see the living hostages freed, but still Hamas refusing to hand over bodies. We see them dribbling out after even earlier saying they didn't have any more. We do see incidents, security, some serious ones taking place in the Gaza Strip. Vice President Vance urging Israel to be patient. You wonder how patient Israel can be in this stage.
I read the tea leaves somewhat differently than Alon. The statements, the public images that we get, I'm not sure what that means. We have to guess as to what that means behind the scenes. But clearly, now one thing we certainly agree on, and that is Trump, Vance, Marco Rubio, if he comes next week. We have, of course, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who are also here. And this is it's a full court press, to use the American basketball phrase, in order to do everything possible to keep the ceasefire together, keep the momentum going for the process. That's the first stage, and I think basically we agree on that, although I don't agree that it's primarily pressure on Netanyahu. If there are violations by Hamas, like killing the soldiers a couple of days ago, and then the bomb that may or may not have been planted recently that caused the injuries today, that those are Hamas violations. Also, as you mentioned, the very slow process of turning over the bodies. So there's a lot of pressure on Hamas. Now, how that gets translated into action, we don't know. I think it's also important to realize that we had yesterday the visit of the head of Egyptian intelligence. We've had contacts with Turkey, with Qatar. All these things are part of the process to go to the next stage. And I think there is a big emphasis. The 200 American troops that are in Kiryat Gat and that staging center, that's not for maintaining the ceasefire. That's for the day after. That is for reconstructing, first of all, disarming Hamas, and then also starting to reconstruct Gaza. That is really, really difficult. Did the administration know how difficult it was going to be? I'm not sure, but they're certainly learning about it now.
Right. I do want to note, Gerald, though, that Israel certainly has been given freedom of action, and alone freedom of action by the administration to respond when these security incidents. Yeah. But in other steps, though, for example, limiting humanitarian aid or closing the Rafah corridor with Egypt, it does seem, according to reports, there was pressure from the U.S. on Israel not to take steps that would overall endanger the ceasefire. I mean, I would like Alon your response, or Gerald, on that.
Well, okay, so let me submit to both of you the following proposition. Some of it but some of it I'm submitting to you. First is, look, Hamas is not going to disarm. They're not going to disarm willingly. I don't expect them to. I have very little expectations as to their credibility or goodwill. So they will not disarm. Since the IDF's withdrawal is in a no man's land, the flexibility and the mobility of the force is such that friction is almost inevitable. Okay, these two are givens. That means that there is a good chance that as a result of miscalculation or misunderstanding, or the so-called strategic corporal, the guy who shoots back and creates an event that immediately assumes strategic proportions. But here's what I'm submitting to you: that Netanyahu, whether he's right or wrong, I leave to everyone's judgment here. That Netanyahu has been trying to convince the Americans that even if the ceasefire is broken because of Hamas, because of their intransigence, because you can't trust them, et cetera, all true, that even if Israel is required to launch a new offensive, it'll be swift, it'll be decisive. And here's what I'm submitting to you. He's telling the Americans, don't worry about the rest of the agreement. In fact, following in the aftermath of such an Israeli military operation, the likelihood and the viability of the so-called Trump plan in fact, increases rather than decreases, since the hostage issue is happily removed, the live hostages at least, is happily removed from the calculus. And Israeli action would facilitate a better later implementation of the next phases. Now, whether he's right, whether he's wrong, and whether the Americans are going to buy into that, or whether you two are going to buy into that, I don't know. But I'm saying this is the thinking, and it's consistent with what Trump said the other day, yesterday actually, that if Hamas don't get their act together, their end will be fast and furious. I'm paraphrasing. And so I'm not ruling out that the ceasefire will collapse, but that does not necessarily mean the end of the agreement.
Right. I mean, I think we would all agree that down the road, the governance of Gaza, that is, there are many hills and valleys before we reach that point. I'm going to let Gerald respond in a minute, but I do want to point out there is certainly one issue, which is an immediate issue in the sort of phase 2 of the agreement, and that is the composition of the international security force that is expected to enter Gaza, I would say, as soon as possible. And we know that there are already some issues there. Vice President Vance addressing that yesterday, especially the role of Turkey, saying Israel is not going, the U.S. won't force any country on Israel in terms of this ISF, but he does see a role for Turkey in Gaza, or the Trump administration sees a role for Turkey in Gaza. That's got one of the issues they're discussing right now. And now, Gerald, I'll give you a chance to respond.
First of all, these are very complex negotiations at that one level, and that is the United States and Israel, and Netanyahu and Trump, and Vance as the vice president and the others. These are really complex issues. And the level of detail, of course, that Israel has, the experience that we have is, and the failures, this is a long history of failures of all sorts of forces out there in these kinds of situations. And certainly the American team doesn't have that experience, that record. These are not people who have been immersed in all the complexities of post-war and during war Middle Eastern issues. So we have Israelis all know about the failure of, after the Lebanon War, of UNIFIL, of the international forces, and we can go back many years. So there's going to be a dialogue, and there are going to be pressures back and forth, but I don't see this as America forcing Israel to do, and forcing Netanyahu particularly to do things which are not seen as in Israel's interest. These are going to be, as you said, they're going to be debated for a while. But I think the time frame is shorter than let's wait to see what happens with the ceasefire. And the issue of Turkey is a serious one. There is a clear disagreement on that, and it's not clear how that's going to be resolved. It's very difficult. Turkey has been a primary supporter, like Qatar, of the Hamas framework, the Muslim Brotherhood, and others. Turkey has ambitions, regional ambitions, the return of the Sultanate of the Ottoman Empire. Israel does not want to allow Turkey or Egypt to have a foothold in Gaza. That's going to be counter to Israeli security interests. Absolutely no way of knowing how that's going to pan out. These things have to be discussed. That's a lot of what the negotiations are about now. I just want to say a quick comment about the aid issue too. Israel responds, or Netanyahu, we're really talking about, we saw the resignation or the removal of Tzachi Hanegbi. Netanyahu is the decision maker in all of this. And whatever, maybe Ron Dermer is still involved probably, and a few others. But this is with a more complex and more multifaceted administration. On the issue of aid, because the aid is a lever that Israel can use, maybe the only lever if the IDF is not acting. So Israel's going to be more careful, much more stringent, opening and closing the corridor. The Americans, understandably, want to have the process move forward, and therefore they're going to want the aid to go ahead. And it's going to continue to be an issue. If there are going to be more incidents, then they're going to be getting more cutoffs on aid. The question is also who's going to provide the aid. I think it's a very critical issue that we tend to overlook. Israel, finally, after many years, the Israeli government, Netanyahu, understands that UNRWA, the whole UN process, all the different UN agencies have been allied with Hamas. The aid has been open for diversion, theft, all of those other things that have been going on. Who's going to deliver the aid? Recently, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that set up that alternative aid framework, particularly in southern Gaza, just before the end of the war, the last few months, they closed down operations. They said temporarily. There's got to be some sort of replacement. All those NGOs that I spend a lot of, unfortunately, my colleagues spend a lot of time documenting the way in which they're allied with Hamas and other terrorist organizations and don't do diligence. Who's going to replace them? That's also got to be on the agenda, and it's got to be on the agenda very soon. The aid is critical, and it can't just be going back to the old model.
Right. I was going to add to what you're just saying, Gerald. We reports again of one issue that's already come up. For example, Hamas or other organizations requesting steam shovels and tractors into Gaza in order to start clearing the rubble left over, and Israel having qualms because they know this kind of construction material was used to build the terror tunnel. So, Alon, I want you to weigh in on that, and also the question of Tzachi Hanegbi. I think is we don't have to go into details for our viewers, but it's relevant in that some critical decisions are going to have to be made in the next, if not days, certainly weeks, by the Prime Minister. Not everything can be kicked down the road, and how ready and equipped is he going to be doing that with also all other domestic political constraints that are on him as well?
So you want me to weigh in on the issue of tractors?
I think it's bigger than. The issue is terror tunnels, not tractors, and I think that's why it's such a big issue.
John Deere or Caterpillar. I don't know. Look, the issue of humanitarian aid, I totally agree and subscribe to what Gerald said about humanitarian aid being an issue or point of contention, and that Israel is going to be stringent. That will obviously delay any kind of an establishment or formation of the so-called International Stabilization Force, which is a euphemism for the Arab Provisional Force, which is a euphemism for the Palestinian Authority being a part of that governance structure, all of which Mr. Netanyahu and his government oppose. Right or wrong, again, I'm not getting into that. And there's going to be even more world condemnations on the issue of humanitarian aid. Now, what I am afraid, I'm looking at, forget afraid, is that the issue of humanitarian aid does not become a serious contention point between Israel and the Trump administration, because that is not going to be pleasant. Because on the one hand, you're right, and Gerald was right, the U.S. will not impose on Israel to open the Rafah crossing and to allow 173 more trucks rather than 90 trucks, whatever the numbers are, if Israel deems it insecure and dangerous. However, if it all boils down to how much humanitarian aid goes in, who does it, and this is where Gerald was absolutely right, there needs to be some kind of replacement, or there's going to have to be some kind of a going back to the UN, which Israel is not going to like, but the idea is out there already. And so I see this as a major obstacle in the next few weeks. As for Tzachi Hanegbi, well, look, again, I don't want to get into the details on the, the nuts and the bolts and the fly on the wall imaginary account of what happened there. Look, it was an ugly dismissal, okay? But that's Netanyahu's style. I'm not getting into that. He's entitled to do that. They could have just announced that Tzachi Hanegbi said that he's finished his, he's fulfilled his mission, and he needs time for his family, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Actually, reportedly, there were health issues too that could have been emphasized.
Well, there are health issues. I didn't want to get into that, and I'll leave that to Mr. Hanegbi. But the point of the matter is, and I know I'm saying something which, to our viewers may sound somewhat unpopular or counterintuitive. The National Security Council in Israel, which in Netanyahu's credit and his former and first aide and first head under Netanyahu, Uzi Arad, was designed as a heavy-duty, serious clearinghouse on these issues, has lost a lot of its power, lost a lot of its aura, lost a lot of its responsibilities and authority. I hear people quoting that Netanyahu, or sources close to Netanyahu, that he relieved Hanegbi or fired Hanegbi, call it what you want, because Hanegbi opposed the attack on Qatar. Come on, since when does what the head of the National Security Council says on Qatar is a cause for dismissal? That's not serious. There's something else behind this. I don't know what.
All right. I just know many people feel that Minister Ron Dermer, for example, took over a lot of the responsibilities in a way that had been done in the past by the National Security. So I want to. You do raise an interesting issue there, Alon, about the Palestinian Authority. Again, its role in Gaza, supposedly under the agreement, only comes after some kind of period of reform that's not specified. It would seem to be an issue down the road. But Gerald reports today of two senior PA officials going to Egypt specifically to consult with the Egyptians as they are setting up, and certainly the Egyptians will be one of the, if not the key player in this security force being assembled. Again, is this another one of those issues that Israel may have to confront perhaps sooner rather than later?
There are a lot of issues that Israel is going to have to confront in the next few weeks. These issues are not going to be, as you said earlier, not be able to be kicked down the road, because something has to happen in Gaza to change the status quo and to prevent Hamas from taking over. Let's remember that when Israel withdrew in August of 2005, it withdrew and handed the keys to the Palestinian Authority. And then there was a very violent coup by Hamas in 2007. Is the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which is really a very corrupt, very archaic type of a system. Abbas, what's in his 20th year of a 5-year term or something like that as president. To be able to repeat that history is something that Israelis are going to be very reluctant to do. But then the question becomes, what's your alternative? And that's the problem. That's been the problem really for the last 2 years at least. If you're not going to agree to the various proposals on the table, some sort of interim government, some sort of Arab-based framework, the role of the PA, so what are you going to put instead of that? And the army certainly does not want to be the IDF. The chief of staff has made it very clear, does not want to be the acting governor of Gaza with whatever it is, 1.7 or something like that, Palestinians. And that's not what the army's for. So what's your alternative? And that's being banged out. I think it's going to be very difficult. And Israel's going to have to, all sides are going to have to make compromises on this. There may be a symbolic or more than symbolic role for the PA. Is Egypt going to be involved? Is Qatar going to be involved? There's been talk about the UAE. Well, the UAE or Indonesia, they can provide some symbolic troops, but they're not going to do the hard security tasks. So all of this got to be developed. And there's another point that's important. When Vice President Vance went to see the command center, I've forgotten what the formal name they put up. Where is it? It's in Kiryat Gat. It's in Israel. It's not in Gaza. They're not going to repeat the catastrophe of the American Marine Force in Lebanon after the 1982 war that was replaced Israeli forces, Israeli troops, and was blown up with hundreds of casualties back in those days by Hezbollah. Boots on the ground are not going to be seen in Gaza. So who others boots are going to be there? The U.S. is going to be operating this remote control. And that's something that's another fact of life that we have to take into account. So there are more questions, more difficulties than we have substantive responses.
Right. We just have about a minute left. Alon, a last word. Again, you have to wonder if the U.S. is not going to put boots on the ground in Gaza, certainly not if this thing is going to ultimately hold together.
Well, okay. This is why I'm extraordinarily skeptical about the next phases, and I just don't see them being implemented. All sides lack goodwill, trust, and I question. I don't question. Let me put it this way: the key question is how engaged and committed the U.S. will remain beyond the ceasefire. If Hamas does not disarm, if Israel goes in, if war flares up, it then winds down, is the U.S. still committed to the implementation of the same plan that was presented 2 weeks ago in the White House? I doubt that. So right. to repeat Gerald, I know we're out of time, to repeat what Gerald said, the question is always, what's the alternative?
Right.
Because
We'll have to leave it at that. What is the alternative? It's a good question to end with. Alon Pinkas, Professor Gerald Steinberg. Thank you for joining us on ILTV. And that is a wrap for this edition of ILTV, broadcasting live from Israel in the heart of the Middle East. We're here every hour with the latest breaking developments, reports, and insights. Stay with us throughout the day, and thank you for joining us.